It's a great pleasure to have a chance to talk to Michael Langford. Michael, when and where were you born?
I was born in London, in Chiswick, June the 29th, 1931.
Right. Tell me something about your family. I mean, go back as far as you like on either side.
Well, my parents were very different. My father was a doctor who came from a wealthy family, Manchester, Nouveau Riche. He managed a thing called the Manchester Velvet Company. His father drank himself to death with whiskey at the age of 70. And my father was brought up in the lap of luxury. And my mother was brought up in very rough circumstances. Her father had been an Anglican priest who left the Church of England and became a Unitarian minister on doctrinal and other grounds. He was an early member of the Labour Party. And my mother was brought up in Wales and won the first ever scholarship to Cambridge from a little local school there, and went up to Newnham as a history scholar. Then she went to do a dip-ed at Manchester and met my father, and the rest is history, as they say.
What subject did you do at Cambridge?
She did history,
yeah.
Yes. And my father was, used to go to Rutherford's lectures at Manchester and places like that. Not a very lovely man, but not an academic at all, like my mother was.
Yes, well, I mean, can you go back any further along the lines? Or?
Well, indeed. My mother, after she's widowed, became a genealogist. And the Langfords, we got back to farmers in Herefordshire in the mid-18th century, and another whole lot were farmers called Dixon in Northumberland. But on my mother's side, there was an intellectual streak of very interesting naval surgeons at Plymouth, one of whom, George Bellamy, fought at the Battle of the Nile, and he's quite well known. And his notebooks are being presently looked at the University Library here because of his great interest. He went on to 1863, where he died in his 90s. And I have his family silver, actually.
He didn't sell off the family silver.
No.
So tell me something about your infancy or early childhood.
Well, my early childhood was happy until the war broke out. I was sent to a horrid little prep school, which fortunately I was saved from by the outbreak of war. But we were happy.
Name this place? Or?
It was called Gunnersbury in Chiswick. And it was an awful place, but I won't elaborate any further. I wasn't abused or anything like that, though some people were. And then when the war broke out...
Were you a boarder or a day boy?
No, it was day boy.
Day boy.
And then when war broke out, war was imminent, and we all went to my uncle's in Prestine on the Herefordshire-Radnorshire border. And I remember sitting in a circle on September the 3rd, and listening to Joseph Chamberlain announcing the beginning of war, and my parents looking very grave. And for a year we were there with no schooling, but my father went back and was the doctor in the Blitz. And then I was sent to a very lovely co-educational prep school called the Fröbel, where I was until I was 12. I was very happy there. Then at 12 I went to St Paul's.
Was that boarding?
That was boarding, yes, because of the Blitz. Then I went to St Paul's, to the London Day School, but for a year I was boarding, and I hated that. I was very homesick. It was a bit brutal, but very good educationally. And then I was a day boy from the age of 14.
This is the St Paul's in London?
St Paul's, London, yes.
Yep.
And I had very good education there. My passion was chemistry, an excellent chemistry master, and I still remember the math teaching when I was 14, the top maths form which I was in, being introduced to calculus by Mr. Mokes. And I remember this to this day, that he put on the board this curved surface, and then the little boxes, and then the idea of infinite number of little boxes, and then the idea of differential calculus and its invention, as we then believed by either Leibniz or Newton. But I think we now have evidence that it was actually Archimedes who came up with that, but that's another story, yes. But I was very well taught, and my love was chemistry. And after military service, I went to New College.
Hang on, you're going too fast.
Yes.
Let's go back to the age of 7. I think you had some memory of the King's abdication.
Yes, this is my first political memory.
Your first political memory?
Yes. It was the abdication of Edward VIII. and the other little boys in this horrid school were talking about it, and one of them said, "Have you heard the shocking news?" And I said, "What's that?" He said, "They found the king with all these bottles of beer under his bed, and therefore he's got to go." And I looked very shocked. It didn't make any sense to me, but I told my parents, who just laughed and laughed, and they realized that someone hadn't wanted to talk about reality. And I still remember to this day the mock shock which I had when I heard this story.
When you were that age, do you remember any interests or hobbies you had, or reading around the age of 7, 8, 9?
Very little. I seriously began to read when I was at the Fröbel, when I was 9 years old. But my mother read to us the old style Dickens stories and things like that. So I had the lilt of Dickens and some other good reading like that. My passion was toy soldiers, and I also played the violin and began to love music. I was introduced to that.
And were the toy soldiers representatives of the British Empire?
To some extent, yes. I think I was pretty jingoistic in those days. And I was always the good king, and my brother, my younger brother, was the bad king who had to get defeated. And my older sister was nowhere around.
What about games? Did you play any games at that time?
Not very much. A little bit of tennis, but I missed out. And then when I went to the Fröbel, it was a lovely school in many ways, but we had very desultory games, except for netball, and I was the only boy in the team. There were, I forget how many are in the team. I think there were 10 girls or whatever, and myself. And we used to go to other local prep schools, mostly all girls, and I was the only boy. I felt terribly embarrassed. But I was, when I got to St Paul's at 12, they assumed that you'd been at a prep school where you'd been properly taught, and I loved cricket, had quite a good eye, but I hadn't got the background, so I was always just a club player, never trained in that way.
When you were at St Paul's, what, apart from chemistry, were your real interests?
Debating society. We had the what was called the Union, which went right back to about 1830, where we had quite serious debates, particularly in the 8th form, which would be 6th form in most places. I made a lot of very close friends, nearly all chemists. And in my last year, I was very tied up with the Christian fellowship, which is very unusual because school Christian fellowships tend to be very evangelical. And this was very liberal, run by a group of enthusiastic old Paulines, but who had learnt Darwinism and all the rest of it. And my family were not church-going. My father was very anti-clerical. And that triggered my interest and desire to be ordained.
There seems to be a leap of logic there. The anti-Christianity of your parents leads to your desire to be ordained.
Yes, it's very logical in a sense, given the revolt of the next generation.
I see.
My 2 daughters, one has kept her faith and one is agnostic, but you tend to get this extraordinary switch. I loved my father, he was a great man, but I rebelled against his... He wasn't actually an atheist, but he had no time for church and Christianity.
What about your mother's character?
She was sympathetic agnostic until later in life, when she got, after I was ordained, and she went back to the church at that point.
And what sort of person was she?
A lovely, very human person, an excellent magistrate, particularly working with juvenile and other areas of that kind, and kept up her intellectual interests all her life from her days at Newnham.
She was an intellectual.
Yes, definitely a blue stocking. Yes.
Were you confirmed?
Yes, at my last year or so at school, after I'd begun to take, most of the children were confirmed at 12 and 13 in a kind of ritualistic, rather meaningless way.
Yeah.
But for me, and the chaplain to the school, Chris Heath, had a first in mathematics and was a very respected math teacher, and he was considerable help to me.
Did you go through some kind of religious awakening, or
Not a sudden one, no. It was a gradual thing. I was attracted by the community of people who were genuinely, both the other boys, it was all boys in this case, and the staff at the house parties, the genuine concern, without being over dramatic or anything. It's just an enormous sense of warmth, and that led me to read Christianity, particularly in the liberal tradition, very differently.
When you say read, were there any particular books that?
Well, in those days I used to read. It was a little before most of C.S. Lewis, but he was just coming on the market. And Dorothy Sayers, The Man Born to be King, I remember, and other things like that.
Yeah. And were you already interested in philosophy in some wider sense?
During my military service, which I very foolishly volunteered for the Korean front, and having become they forced me to switch from the infantry to the artillery at the officers' training selection because of my mathematics. I'd got to Oxford on maths and additional mathematics, physics and chemistry. So I became a subaltern in the Royal Artillery, and just by luck I was kept in Japan training troops. With one visit to the front line carrying dispatches. One of my friends was killed by a shell. With hindsight, I wouldn't have volunteered because, although I'm not a pacifist, I think that Syngman Rhee and the South Korean regime was not something I'd necessarily want to lay down my life for. And I've taken a much more negative view of war now than I did then.
Was this happening before you went to Oxford or after?
This was in my national service before, yes. And it was during that time that I decided that 4 years chemistry wouldn't make as much sense as 3 years PPE if I was going to be ordained. And my first day back at New College, I went to see Mr. Staveley, the chemistry tutor, and explained, and he was very flexible and allowed me to switch to PPE, which nowadays he wouldn't be allowed to do, but given the context and the fact I was now 20, I'd done my military service, they were very
So you went to Korea, what, 1949?
1950, 50 and 51.
Do you have any, I mean, you said you were stationed in Japan. Do you have any particular memories of Japan at that time?
Yes, I have many. While I was taking troops up into the mountains to be fit, who'd just come off the troop ships, I remember seeing this Japanese peasant walking along, and 10 yards behind, his wife loaded up with sticks and everything, and bearing all the bod, and thinking what a strange world this is. And I got to know quite a lot of Japanese people. I was fire officer in the camp, and we had a fire engine run by Japanese people, and I got to know quite a lot of the Japanese people this way. And then one occasion when I was orderly officer, one of the Japanese people who were servants was caught thieving. So immediately I put him in a jeep and took him to the local Japanese police station, and he was absolutely terrified. And the next morning I was summoned before the CO and the adjutant and given a terrible bollocking because I was meant to have kept him on campus to be interviewed by our RCMP. But then I discovered afterwards they were laughing like anything because what I did was far more effective. This chap was terrified of Japanese policemen being reported to them. So I got a bollocking on the front, but actually they were rather pleased with what I did. It set a kind of precedent.
Did you learn any Japanese?
A little bit. I learnt quite a lot more when I went back in 1977 to practice Aikido in Tokyo.
And were there still terrible signs of the war in that point?
I was being taught to drive in my spare time, and we used to drive to Hiroshima, and I saw the consequences of the Hiroshima bombing. That I didn't physically see anything else. And the Japanese I met were amazingly friendly and forgiving, given what had just happened to them, and the atrocities of the war. Quite extraordinary.
And Tokyo had been bombed.
Yes, I went there once, but I didn't see the destruction. I went there on a week's 4-day vacation, but the part I went to was the Marinucci Hotel around there was all right.
You find the Japanese very friendly and easy to relate to?
I always have, yes. I know that the sinister side, and there are certain no-go areas. I tend, unless I know them very well, not to talk about Nanjing and the occupation of China and so on. They're very strange people in some ways.
In what ways?
Their sense of what is proper and their sense of humour are just so different. It's not that they don't have them, but they're very different from ours. And I, particularly when I went back the second time as a gaijin, I was often invited into people's homes, and I remember sitting in one home being shown a whole lot of samurai swords, being waited upon by the wife and daughter, and he said to me, "Don't think this is how we normally live. we live as a family and we know, but because you're a guest, this is why we do it in the traditional style. My men friends, they don't come here. I entertain them at the local pub. It's a very strange custom, that. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so you went to New College. Did you get an exhibition or a scholarship?
No, I didn't. I was I just went up to read chemistry.
Why Oxford?
Because I knew from my school teachers that if you wanted to do chemistry, pure and simple, Oxford was the place to go. More than I didn't want to do physics and chemistry, which I'd have had done at Cambridge. So it was my first choice. And New College I chose to because I think it looked beautiful. Later on I came to love it, particularly the musical tradition there.
You mentioned music. Were you, when you were at university, were you singing or playing? Or?
No, I played. I played in Professor Westrop's orchestra in the first violins, and I played in 2 quartets, and spent far more time making music than I should have done. And I played a little bit of cricket for the second 11, and I played a bit of rugby, and generally I had a very good social time. I didn't work very hard, I'm afraid.
But there were no girls at that time?
No, I knew a few girls, but none of them were, because there were very, very few at Oxford. There was Lady Margaret Hall and the others. And I sat next to one at the orchestra who I rather fancied, but there were few and far between.
Yes. So this is between about 52 and...
51 and 54.
54. You'd done a lot of debating earlier. Did you do any?
No, that's something I didn't pursue. If I'd wanted to go into politics, it was one of the ways in. Because I've always found public speaking not terribly burdensome, but rather fun. So had I wanted to go into politics, which is one of the things with hindsight I might have been interested in, except I'd never got anywhere as a liberal, as unlikely to have made much mark. But the union was the way to do that.
And what else were you doing at Oxford?
Well, I had fairly active social life, a lot of friends, a drinking, whining society. We had 1927 Wars Port at 14.6 a bottle, I remember, at the college. I helped run a youth club, and 2 orchestras and a quartet, and some work and some sport. That was it. I was pretty busy. And with hindsight, I didn't use the educational opportunity. I had marvellous tutors, starting with Herbert Hart.
Tell me something about him.
He was a strange man. I got on very well with him because he taught me symbolic logic. And having done maths and additional maths, I found no difficulty in it, and many of the other 15 people doing PPE with me found it rather heavy going. So that was great. And then he became Professor of Jurisprudence, and under the arcane rules of Oxford wasn't allowed to teach undergraduates.
Was he a good teacher?
Yes, in my experience he was. But I only had him for symbolic logic. Then I started philosophy proper. I did 5 of my 8 papers really in philosophy, including political philosophy. And I was farmed out to Isaiah Berlin, which was a fascinating experience.
Tell me about that.
Well, that was extraordinary. I'd go normally on my own to All Souls. He'd been a fellow at New College, and I was farmed out to All Souls for him. And he'd sit and he'd talk and ask questions occasionally. I'd read him a paper. And he was very friendly, nice, but I was far too naive to appreciate what was going on. I remember one supervision, we were talking a bit about the philosophy of history, and he said, of course, rank, you know all about rank. And I said, no, I don't know about rank, so I had to go up and read about him. And of course the whole question of the nature of historical thought and historiography, I was so naive I didn't know who this chap was. But Stephen Leacock used to say, if you go to Oxford for 3 years, you're smoked at and you come out differently, and I suppose I did. And my other tutors were Michael Dummett, who I had for a short time.
Just a moment more on Berlin. His lectures were famous. Did you go to those?
I occasionally went to them, mostly with the supervisions. His lectures were just performances, particularly on people like Saint-Simon and Comte and people like that, just extraordinary. I was very lucky because he was not in the normal Oxford mode. I mean, he knew his analytic philosophy, but he was far more broad-ranging in his views than that. And my other tutor later on teaching me logic was Stuart Hampshire. He again was a very nice man. I remember one particular supervision, sitting in the garden with him, just the 2 of us, and we were talking, and we got onto the subject of theology and of linguistic theory. And I said to Stuart Hampshire, well, your position depends on this particular theory of language. And that's quite different even from A.J. Ayres of 1936. And from in 50 years, there'll be another theory of language. And he looked at me and said, Langford, that's very cynical. And I admired him particularly for his writings. But I always thought that was not an adequate reply.
He didn't believe in paradigmatic changes in linguistic theories. I
think, well, I got the impression that he thought that Oxford analytical philosophy was there to stay, which it may be, of course. Certainly it'll be there to stay as an element in philosophy, but as an overarching adequate model, I doubt that.
Were the supervisions you mentioned with Isaiah Berlin that you read your essays to him, or did he read them? Or
no, and I'm actually critical of this, of the whole Oxford system. I'd read the essay to him. When I've supervised at Cambridge, I've had the essay beforehand.
Yes.
So I've saved half the time, because instead of listening to all this garbage and then picking up things, I've read it before and said, look, that doesn't work, or something like that. No, and that was universally the system. You'd read the essay, and I think that
he
was
would
a
interrupt.
Sometimes he would, yes, but often he'd wait till the end, and then he'd come out with his fire, fully justified.
And you mentioned Michael Dummett.
Yes, I only had him for 2 or 3 supervisions when I think Isaiah Berlin wasn't available or something like that. He was not a good supervisor, not at that level. He was far too abstract. And when we asked, I was with another student on this occasion, and I remember asking some basic questions about primary and secondary qualities in Locke, and we went into some long thing which we didn't follow. He just wasn't on our wavelength. That was his early days, of course. He might have improved.
So this is the philosophy stream. What about the other P and the E?
I did 2 papers in economics, and that was with Peter Wiles, who was a fascinating man who I got on very well with. I visited him later on when he was a professor at LSE. His speciality was Russian economics, and he used to amuse us by telling us how the Stalin or whoever would tell him the result of the great survey, and then his economists would come up and cook the figures and come up with the result, and he was able to document this. He was a very nice man. I didn't do any work for him, unfortunately. And then I had Herbert Nicholas, who was my politics tutor, and he was a delightful, and I kept up with him until his death and went to his funeral, actually. And he was one of my referees, because he was the one I got on particularly well with. And I did de Tocqueville with him, and I did a paper on American political theory, and one on general political theory, which is really a philosophy paper.
But philosophy was your most...
Yes, that was the thing I was interested in, because I reckoned it would be a better background for ordination, and I just got hooked on philosophy, and I didn't know at that time I was going to be a professional philosopher.
When you mentioned ordination, were you a member of OIQ?
Yes, OUCU, not OIQ, which was the evangelical one. I was a member of the other one, which C.S. Lewis used to speak to.
Not the intercollegiate.
No, not that. No, the fundamentalism has always appalled me in various ways.
You didn't go to St. Aldate's?
Exactly. I went there once and I was absolutely horrified. I remember the sermon was talking about how either you were an atheist, which was irrational, or you were an agnostic, which was sitting on the fence unnecessarily, or you were a genuine Christian. This incredibly superficial thing just really annoyed me. First of all, I think that atheism is a rational position. My objection to Dawkins, for example, is not his atheism, it's his irrationalism, because he caricatures the best, just as I wouldn't criticize atheism by saying, look at Stalin, so I wouldn't criticize Christianity by saying, look at Torquemada. And I'm being superficial, but I think atheism is one of the 7 or 8 rationally tenable positions. And I think liberal theism is another one. So I was a member of this much more rational C.S. Lewis approach. Not that I always agreed with C.S. Lewis, but that's not.
Was Lewis around then?
Yes, he used to come and talk to us in this group.
What was he like?
A marvellous lecturer, and a very funny man as well. I wasn't there in his famous interview with or dispute with Elizabeth Anscombe. I missed that, unfortunately.
What was that about?
She took him to task on some logical point and was reckoned to have won, and C.S. Lewis was very upset by it, but I wasn't there, so I don't want to comment on who was right and who was wrong.
And you knew Elizabeth Anscombe as well, did you?
I didn't know her. I used to go to her some lectures which she gave, and I sat in on a number of occasions when she was at a conference, or 2 or 3 philosophy conferences, where she was reading and speaking and arguing with other people. I didn't take to it terribly, I'm afraid, partly because I fundamentally disagree with one of her central claims in philosophy, which is that moral obligation is only coherent if you have a theism which gives you someone who gives the obligation. I follow Herbert Hart in thinking that the origin of ethics is in social rules. And when you have social rules, the notion of interior obligation is part of what goes with it. And that therefore an atheist can feel moral obligation just as much as the Jew or a Christian. So that's a fundamental philosophical disagreement with Elizabeth Anscombe.
Interesting. Was there a philosophical society which people would have visiting lecturers? And
there were, and I didn't go to it. I went to the odd one. But I was too involved in my social life and things like that. And I did, at that point, although I loved philosophy, I wasn't thinking of becoming a professional philosopher. That happened by happenstance, we may come on to later on.
Okay, so you did well in the exams?
Yeah, moderate. I didn't do brilliantly, but I did all right.
Yes. You got a first or?
No, I got a just missed one here, 2-1. Had I worked, my tutor said I should have got a first, but I was far too idle.
And then
they didn't have 2 1s, of course.
No.
Yeah.
Borderline. What happened then?
Then I spent 6 months in a factory, which was one of the things they recommended for ordained people proposing ordination, the Bristol Aeroplane Company. And then I went to Cambridge to do the theological training for 2 years, a course called the COC, which was the equivalent of an undergraduate course, but was higher powered than GOE, and I did that for 2 years at Westcott House, but didn't have a formal degree for it. Then I was ordained. And I was taught by Robert Runcie, by John Habgood, among other people. I was very lucky. And I went to lectures in the divinity faculty, Charlie Mole in particular, who's a marvellous lecturer.
Yes. Do you want to elaborate on any of those 3 famous names?
Well, Robert Runcie was an extraordinarily humane person, and I was very sorry when he went off and became Dean of Trinity Hall, and I wasn't taught by him anymore. And believe it or not, he taught me Old Testament in the most brilliant way, as well as, and I got a series of A's in all the classes he taught me in these equivalent tripods. And then John Habgood came, who of course had been a fellow of King's in biology, I think, and was started as an evangelical and gradually got more and more what I would call rational. And he was a brilliant lecturer as well. And Ken Carey, who was not an intellectual but a very fine spiritual person, who headed the college. And it was 2 years of a very good training for the professional ministry.
Why are you so against evangelicals?
Because I think they have, it depends. The 2 main problems I have. One is the substitution theory of the atonement, which I think is a caricature and means a lot of more rational people looking at Christianity are put off it.
Can you explain?
The idea that the explanation of why Jesus died is that he thereby paid the penalty which you and I ought to pay, and that he, as a substitute, whereas I take much more Abelardian point of view, that we are so drawn to this life as it should be that we enter another level of living. It's the power of persuasion. As Whitehead used to say, so God works by persuasion when properly understood. And this respects human dignity, and also a kind of more Platonic approach of being caught up in the community. But the idea is a kind of judicial thing, that is that penalty which you can't pay, and Jesus paid it by his blood. As metaphor, it's powerful, but when it's taken literally, that's one of my 2 objections to the evangelical tradition. The other is verbal inspiration. If God dictated the book of Joshua, then God becomes very unpleasant, ordering the slaughter of women and children. And I was delighted to discover that this more liberal view was right there in the 2nd and 3rd centuries with people like Origen, who didn't take this literalist view. It's much more since the Reformation we've had that view. And the same goes for Islam. Islam is still stuck with this because even relatively liberal Muslims tend to believe that the Quran is literally dictated by, or through Gabriel, but effectively by God, including, you know, the hands and feet should be cut off and things like that. Liberal Islam has to get away from that, as liberal Christianity has.
Do you think it can get away from
Yes, in the long run. I've already met liberal Muslims who are faithful to the mainstream tradition, but who want to distance the core Quran from the social Quran, and they have to be careful where and how they say this. If they say this in Libya or Egypt, they'll get killed. Now, I think Islam can have a liberal version which can overcome this huge problem.
Perhaps I can put a question I put to the Archbishop of Canterbury, ex-Archbishop Rowan Williams, which was my philosophical problem, one of them, when I began to question my Christianity at the age of 18, 19, 20. And this was, well, it's the problem that C.S. Lewis deals with, or tries to, in The Problem of Pain, which is, how can you have, on the one hand, an all-powerful, benevolent, loving God who can do what he likes because he's all-powerful, who wants to do wonderful and beautiful things, and then creates the world we see around us.
Yes, of course. The most traditional problem. I've written about this, and what I say is not very original. But first of all, I take what I think is an implication of Aquinas, that I don't believe that God can do whatever he likes. Aquinas is very clear, and this is why I much prefer him to Calvin, that when we talk about omnipotence, there are two particular limitations. One, the nature of goodness, the other, the law of non-contradiction. And to produce something like our species, which, because we don't have time to talk about free will, but I've written defense of this, that has this essential autonomy, there are only certain things which a God could do. Therefore, although God could make many possible worlds, he couldn't make any possible world. And whether there are multiple universes, which I doubt, this is only one of the possible ones if our kind of love is going to be there. So there has to be fragility, there has to be danger, there has to be risk, and there has to be not only humans who can make their own decisions, but an ordered world. And this is Aquinas, again, in this case, on primary and secondary causality, or what he called proximate causality. So the tree falls down because the wind blew and it was rotten, not as in Calvin, because God determined it would. God set up an order of that kind. But I go further and say, unless he set up an order that was autonomous, the kind of love and responsibility which we have couldn't be there. And then, just to summarize this, I think that many religious people, and many Christians included, tend to think of religion as, and prayer as, a God who will manipulate the world to suit us. Whereas I think of religion as being in touch with the spiritual reality which will change us. And then comes the paradox, because if we are changed, then the world gets changed. And particularly with things like psychosomatic medicine and other things, when I read the New Testament, I'm inclined to believe that most of the things there really happened. I'm not a literalist, but it doesn't demand a miracle in the old-fashioned sense, a kind of Humean sense of God changing nature, but what happens when people walk in tune with nature. My father, as I indicated, had no time for religion, but he mentioned that he had one cancer patient who spontaneously cured. Well, if people are walking psychologically in tune with the way they're meant to be, that'll happen far more often. And I think the healing miracles are. I don't rule out the possibility of miracles, but unlike Hume, who thought that you couldn't prove, use miracles to prove God, he was right. But if you believe in a God, then you might think, well, sometimes there might be miracles. I go the other way around.
Well, take the miracles, take two of them, the changing of water into wine, or the walking on the waters. your explanation that it's we who are changed and then we can walk on waters or change wine or whatever?
I wouldn't apply it into those two cases. I'm thinking of much more of the cures. In the case of water into wine, this is in St. John's Gospel, of course, which, very different from the Synoptics, is much more a case of symbolism. I'm not totally committed to the view it couldn't have happened, but I tend to take it as a symbolic occurrence. And the walking on the water, there was a beautiful set of lectures in the divinity faculty recently by an American professor whose name I can't remember, talking about how the New Testament writers were using the Septuagint. And there's one particular passage where it talks about someone walking on the shore and how it would appear to be on the water or in shallow water. So I'm agnostic again. I don't deny the possibility of the theist, that there might be some kind of extraordinary kinetic power to walk on water. But I'm not going to push that and demand that people, if I'm preaching to them, believe that. I think it could have been some extraordinary memory of Jesus on the beach and then reaching out to him and so on. So I don't believe that miracles in the literal sense are essential for Christianity, with the possible exception of the resurrection. And that brings in special difficulties.
One of Hume's, I imagine, difficulties with miracles is that if you have a world ruled in secondary causation, at least, by natural laws which you can study and which are irreversible and all powerful, the moment you allow someone to start fiddling with these, deciding that they will suspend the laws of nature as a miracle, it makes the world totally unpredictable and insecure.
Yes, though I would criticise to some extent that account of Hume, because for Hume the laws of nature are simply what we've observed in constant conjunction. It's not what must happen at all. It's very paradoxical, and his definition of miracle is as violation of a law of nature, given what he means about a law of nature, is self-defeating. His main purpose is to argue that you can't use miracles as to prove that there's a God, and I agree with him on that. But his account of miracles otherwise is very unsatisfactory, because he doesn't have an adequate view of causation, it seems to me, apart from anything else. Therefore his whole account of laws of nature is, I think, philosophically flawed as well. I mean, he's a great man and hugely important, and also he says the miracles of one religion dispute the miracles of another. Well, what about interfaith dialogue? And I'm studying Nicholas Cusa at the moment. By no means all the ancient people would have argued in that way.
And to come back to Aquinas and the tree falls on you, this is like the old argument, a famous argument in anthropology, that the grain store falls on someone. And as Andy know, that what has caused this is white ants gnawing away at the grain store, secondary causation. But they also want to know why it fell on this person at that moment in time. It must have been a witch. Once you take Aquinas and separate the two, then God has no power at all. It's all, he just is the great clockmaker at the beginning and then winds it up.
No, I think that's a mistake myself, because it leaves out the, as deism tends to, the belief that there is a spiritual connection in prayer and in thought all the time, as an Augustine, the sense of the illumination that's going on. Therefore, if people can be in tune with other people and a fortiori with God, and particularly if you bring in a kind of partly Jungian analysis and you take seriously the possibility of a collective unconscious, then God is actively involved, but not pulling strings as in Calvin, but through the spiritual change. So whether or not the tree that lies in Jesus, why did the tower fell? They hadn't done anything particular. So the tree fell, that was the bad luck. But that doesn't mean that at any moment how we live spiritually and morally doesn't dramatically change the way the world goes and our lives go and the future goes. And I know there's a danger here of a kind of dualism in which I've got the mental life and the physical life, and clearly it's more complicated because there's an interrelationship of the two. But I see God as perpetually, continually creative in the spiritual and mental, but not by manipulating subatomic particles. I've never thought that quantum mechanics is some magical way of getting round this difficulty, as some of my colleagues do.
Well, let's return to earth and find out what you did then after Westcott House.
After Westcott House, I had a 2.5-year curacy in Bristol, which I loved. And at that point, I intended to be a parish priest all my life. And I loved the people. I was with a very gifted parish priest called Basil Moss, who later became a provost of Birmingham. And he was a lovely man and his family, and I was welcomed into the whole parish. And and then I was wondering what to do next when this invitation came to be interviewed at Queen's College to be their chaplain. I now know that Henry Hart, who's a lovely man, had gone to Ken Carey and say, who would you recommend to be the next chaplain? And I was interviewed, and so for 4 years I was chaplain. I did a bit of teaching, but not very much in philosophy, but mostly I was running the chapel and the undergraduate program. And this is when everything got changed around personally, because I fell in love with this beautiful girl, and for 5 years she was the kind of apple of my eye, and she decided to marry somebody else very sensibly. But I realized at this personal disaster that being a parish priest as a bachelor was just not on for me. People don't always appreciate how difficult it is for an ordinary full-blooded young man or young woman now to carry out their wooing, because if there's a girl you like in the parish and you ask her out and it doesn't come to anything, you can do terrible damage in the parish and to her. You have to find your hunting ground elsewhere, and that can really be very difficult. This girl whom I fell in love with was not in the parish, it was something quite separate. I don't want to go into the details. We got friendly, but it didn't work out. But I knew that bachelor clergy have a problem finding the right partner, and that some of them take to the bottle or other things. And I was getting more and more interested in philosophy. So I said, I think the academic life may be the one for me. And it was particularly tricky right at the end, because they asked me to stay on as a fellow and to combine it with being rectress and bottoms, which were a permanent feature. Then I had a lovely vicarage in Newnham, and living at Queen's and joining in the feasts and everything for the next 50 years. Very tempting. So when Arthur Armitage, who's a lovely man, the lawyer, put this offer to me from the fellows, I said, give me 24 hours to think about it. And I came back and said, no, I'm going off to be a PhD student. And through his good offices partly, I got a state scholarship to go to King's College London and do a PhD full-time.
Why was
in
that?
Philosophy.
Because you decided you want to be an academic?
Yes, I still wanted to be a priest, but I wanted to be a philosopher and to pursue, and I was particularly interested in the natural law tradition. I did my doctoral thesis on Grotius and the tradition of natural law and revolutionary thought in the 17th century. So I was genuinely fascinated by the topic. But there was also this personal thing that I didn't, although I wanted to be a priest, I didn't want to be a parish priest as a bachelor. And I lived in Hampstead. I was an honorary curate at Hampstead Parish Church. Richard Harries, later Bishop of Oxford, was a very close friend, a godfather to his daughter. And I did this PhD, sitting mostly in the British Museum and being supervised by H.D. Lewis, and wrote this thesis, and successfully. And then at the end of the 3 years, I was thinking, what am I going to do next? But I'm tired of being desperately poor. So I thought, well, these jobs are coming up in Canada and North America, and so I applied for one of them. This
is in the early 60s?
This is 66. And so I applied for the first one I applied for. I got an email back from the head of department, no, not an email, a telegram, saying active interest, partly because one of my supervisors, one of my people who wrote the referees was Donald McKinnon. Another was the man I mentioned, Herbert Nicholas. Another was Robert Runcie. And I was offered the job as assistant professor of philosophy over a 2-year trial period at St John's, Newfoundland. And I went for what is probably the wrong reason. I was offered a much better salary than I'd have had here, and it sounded like fun. And the first 2 years was tax-free and everything. And I stayed 29 years, and I stayed for the right reason. I never tried to move. I loved the place, the people, and everything. And I'd have retired there had there been work for my wife, whom I met at Harvard while I was a visiting scholar there.
Tell me something about Newfoundland. It's mainly Scotsman, I imagine.
No, it's a third Dorset.
Dorset.
And when I went out there in 66, 67, the folklorists were going around getting tapes of Dorset as it sounded in the 18th century, particularly from Poole, and about 18th century and earlier, going right back to the 1500s, about a third of the island was populated from places like Dorset. They're mostly nominally Anglican, and that was a third.
Why from Dorset?
Because there were, once some start going,
yes, chain migration.
Chain migration, and particularly people hopping ship from, and I don't fully know the answer, but something like that. A third were Scots from the great sheep thing, and there was a Presbyterian lot.
Yeah.
Another third, often geographic, and the third were Irish from the great potato famine. So we had these three major groups, often regionally divided. And Newfoundland, then as now, there's a city of St. John's, which goes back to about 1520. Fascinating cosmopolitan city, about 250,000 if you include the outer regions, and another 250,000 scattered around 2,000 outports. Very primitive, beautiful people, but not much education. So you've got these two sides, and the university was in St. John's, and I used to point out to people the oldest city in North America, not counting the Aboriginal cities.
Yes, it's very early, isn't it?
1520, about a sleepover place, and then there are no old buildings because three major fires. And I loved the people, the places, and everything, and they looked after me very well. And I just rose through I became associate full professor, and then I became professor of bioethics at the medical school for my last 9 years, and loved it. And it was just a great place to be.
The teaching system was the same as you were familiar with?
Not quite. I had initially 9 hours teaching. I had no individual supervisions until later. It was more like a red brick university. I'd have 3 hours with an introductory group. The 4-year BA, by the way, in philosophy. 3 hours in a 3rd year class on something like bioethics or something like that, and then 3 hours seminar with 6 students doing jurisprudence in their 4th year. And the best students, like all Canadian universities, got a big range. The best students were excellent, but they ever got first here. And the worst students wouldn't have been at university at all, except they didn't tend to do philosophy. We frightened them off.
And you enjoyed the lecturing and the supervision? I've
always enjoyed pontificating and lecturing, and I'm an Aristotelian. I walk up and down and lecturing, and I very rarely use notes. And I think people like my lectures. Why
is it Aristotelian to walk up and down?
Because the tradition is that when he lectured, he did.
Really?
And that's why he was called the peripatetic philosopher.
I see. How interesting. I've done it naturally without knowing what.
Yes, right. Well, his students claimed that, yes.
And towards the end you met Sally? Or?
I was on my 2nd sabbatical, and I was a visiting scholar at Harvard. And it's a bit of a funny story, this. One of the reasons I wanted to go to Boston was because my Aikido master, I've done this martial art for 50 years, Kanai Sensei, taught there, and I wanted to go and upgrade and sort of train with him. And it's very difficult to park at this place. So I noticed that right opposite the dojo, as they call it, in Boston, there was this Anglican church. So I wrote to the vicar of the Anglican church there at St. Paul's and said, if I come and give voluntary help as a priest, can I use your car park? This chap who'd been Sam Abbott, who'd been a professor of law, by the way. You know, so many Anglican clergy have had other things beforehand, and he'd been professor of law at Boston. And he wrote back and said, fine. So my first Sunday in Boston, I was introduced and put in the pulpit to preach. And Sam Abbott said, after the service, there would be a parish lunch. And I was looking around, and I saw Sally sitting in the 3rd row. And I thought, she looks nice, I'm going to sit next to her at lunch. And a year later, we were married.
How sweet. What year was that?
That was 1984. We've been married 35 years now, 30 years now.
Tell me something about, well, since we've reached Sally, she's a sinologist.
Yes, she was finishing her PhD in Chinese literature and history. And she'd already done all the necessary qualifications. She had a master's at Chicago before, and a master's, she had an earned master's at Harvard. And then she came to Newfoundland. We had the 2 babies there. It was a 12-year PhD, because the Harvard PhD is normally 5 or 6 years anyway, because unlike English PhDs, you've got the general examination, you've got the earned MA and all the rest of it, but it was 12 years, which is quite common. And she finished it, and then was looking around for work, and nearly got quite a prestigious appointment in Canada, but it didn't work out. So she got jobs, offers in part-time offers at the Needham Institute and as a fellow of Wolfson. So we moved to Cambridge. And it worked out very well. I would have been happy to stay in Newfoundland, but Cambridge was the next best. And my 2 girls went to Hills Road Sixth Form College, which of course is excellent school, and we couldn't afford private education, so that worked out very well. And my wife, who's 65 now, quite old, I'm 84, she's still a fellow of Wolfson and still teaches Tang poetry and things like that.
And tell me your explorations in the wine trade in Newfoundland.
Oh yes, I had this extraordinary extra dimension to life, because having always been interested in wine and being a friend of John Avery, the famous wine merchant, and of Peter Cicero, famous wine person in Bordeaux, when I got to Newfoundland I discovered a terrible nakedness in the land, and the wine list for the monopoly was dreadful. So I started a wine club, and with the permission of the authorities I imported wine for the wine club. And then in 1970, after I'd been there 3 or 4 years, they said, will you be our consultant? So for the next 25 years, they sent me at their expense to France or elsewhere and gave me a small fee. And I selected wine for the monopoly 77 outlets. And what happened is, if you start at a terrible situation, whatever you do is good. Well, the Toronto Globe and Mail, a year later, published an article saying, what's happened to Newfoundland? They have the best wine list in Canada. And so my name was made, and even though normally my job would have changed with political fortunes, every time the Conservative or the Liberals got in, I kept this job. And so I became a semi-professional wine consultant, and I learnt on the job.
Yes, and you were guided by someone who was
John Avery, because I said to him, look, I don't really know this, I'm not a professional like you. So usually in May, when I was off, I'd go to Bordeaux or Burgundy with him, and he'd be tasting all these wines, and I'd look at his notes and recommend what he recommended. And after about 25 years, I knew something about it.
When you were there, were you writing as well as teaching?
Yes, I published my first book on the concept of providence with the SCM Press in 1981, I think. Then I published 2 more books while I was there, and wrote a number of articles, some in the Journal of Bioethics. The one that's been most quoted is Who Should Get the Kidney Machine? And the highlight of my academic career possibly was when I was at a bioethics conference, and a very bright woman came up to me and said, are you the Langford who wrote that article? And I said, yes. And she said, my thesis is showing how wrong you are. And I thought, great, because the point of an article is to get debate going and so on. And so I said that she was a bit startled by my reply. We argued about it, and I stuck to my guns, because I was arguing that although a prognosis should be the fundamental criterion, you had to treat people also with a notion of irreplaceability, and that a mother with young children within a different category from a bachelor if both had a similar diagnosis for the kidney, and that the mother with the young children should have them. And that therefore, although prognosis was number 1, it was more complicated than that. But I admitted this was exceedingly dangerous, because at a similar time a Canadian senator had been given a rare organ, and it looked as if he jumped the queue. And senators are not irreplaceable, nor are captains of industry, but I was arguing that mothers are in a crucial sense. But you know, linguistic philosophy, what do you mean by irreplaceability? That was what I was talking about. And that's my most important article probably I've ever published.
Well, there's a big debate going in bioethics at the moment about CRISPR. CRISPR being the way of manipulating genes so that you can potentially design a baby.
Yes.
Which doesn't have all sorts of genetic diseases and so on.
Well, I've talked a lot about this and lectured a bit about this, and I think there is, we were talking earlier, Alan, about when you could make valid distinctions. And this distinction is clearly fragile at the edges, but there is a valid distinction between correction and enhancement. And when you get something like muscular dystrophy, where there is clearly a single gene, or probably a single gene, I don't have any moral problem with if you can knock it out and replacing it. Or the mitochondrial disease, where it's not a single gene, but a tiny selection. Because there, the alternative is to force hundreds, in the long run thousands of children, to die unnecessarily. And I think enhancement, where you try to improve IQ or blue eyes or gender, is much more tricky. And I'm not saying never, never in the future, but I would certainly not want to license that at the moment. But at the moment, most of the plans are things like Huntington's chorea and things like that, where there is a clear defect. And I don't have a problem with genetic engineering in that context. So I think that's, and I was very annoyed with my own Anglican Church and the Roman Catholic Church when they tried to prevent the mitochondrial response. And my friend Richard Harris, who's of course a fellow Anglican, he shared my view. He thought that the church made a mistake there. And they kept saying we need more and more study. We don't in this particular case need more study. But no one at the moment is, designer babies, it's an ambiguous term. If it means removing muscular dystrophy, then I'm for it. My main worry in the long run about designer babies, and in 100 years, let's face it, it may be possible, is not so much whether or not there may be a case for doing some things, improving our spines or our knees, but the political power which it would give to some groups to design for political or other reasons. That, to me, much more scary.
What are your feelings, I mean it's a related field, which is artificial insemination and bringing in eggs and sperm and so on from more than two parents?
Well, because the mitochondrial is, some people, it's very misleading to call it third parent, because it's 2.001 parent. Again, the third parent, if it's to do a correction, then I don't have a problem with it. And I think it's misleading to call it three parents. But the IVF, I have a problem with it, but I'm not against it. Because I think that for some people, infertility is a huge emotional and spiritual problem. And if one can overcome it, then our humanity calls us to find ways to do it. I think there is a price to be paid, and we're into a controversial area here, not only ethically but also biologically. When we interfere with nature, there are sometimes more costs than we realize. And when you prevent the race of the sperm down the birth channel and you select a sperm, you are doing a shortcut, and we don't know the full consequences. And I think there is evidence that when you do artificial means, you'll get a slightly higher proportion of problems. That doesn't mean to me that you should never do it. There are humane reasons for doing it. But I am very cautious. Particularly, I would prefer to let the sperm do the natural race, because nature in the long run often knows what's best. A similar problem, and this is one of my problems with the people who take an extreme view on abortion, I think the evidence from what I've seen of papers is that something like 70% of embryos at some stage from the conceptus onwards are naturally aborted. Sometimes at a very early stage and they don't know. And I think the evidence is that usually for a good reason. Now if we take an absolutist view and we can start preventing that, we're going to be in some way fighting against the natural system of rejecting problematic embryos.
What about abortion, late term?
Well, I take, as you can probably guess, a kind of mixed view here. As a Christian, I tend to think that abortion that's deliberate, and particularly when it's not rape or something, is morally highly questionable. But I don't think it's the job of the law to enforce that. So this is this crucial distinction between the morality of law and the morality of personal ethics. And I think that particularly prior to 24 weeks, as a matter of ethics, the law ought to be liberal and allow the woman to choose. And one of my reasons is this: in the rabbinic tradition, there's no one overall rule, but the general view of rabbis is that it's appropriate to talk about the embryo being a person at the time of viability. Their language is very careful. They don't talk about the infusion of a soul. Whereas in the Catholic tradition, of course, you are a person from the moment of conception. Now, these are two equally supportable philosophical religious positions. And if you don't allow abortion at all, as in Nicaragua and Malta, then what is effectively a Catholic theology is being imposed on an equally rational, sincerely held rabbinic theology, which rabbis don't like abortion, but it's for good reasons. It's permitted in the first 24 weeks. And that seems to me a much sounder argument. So when it comes to the law, my ethical position is very liberal. When it comes to whether I would counsel someone, I'm more conservative. And I think, particularly for reasons of personal convenience, to abort what is at least a potential human being worries me a lot. And speaking personally, our first child was conceived when my wife was 35, and the law in Canada is that you must be offered amniocentesis if you're over 35. And Sally and I agonized over this, and we decided that if we had a Down syndrome baby, we would not be happy with aborting it. So we rejected amniocentesis because of the risk, as you know, associated with that, 0.5%. But we also made another decision that if we did, by misfortune, have a Down syndrome child, the next time we would. In other words, it's because I've known many families who've had Down syndrome child and have the siblings and everything rally round, and although it's a disaster, it's a creative disaster, but I've known one with 2 and it's been unmitigated disaster. So I have a bit of a fudge here. I'm not totally opposed to it. We ourselves decided not to go that route, and we had 2 healthy babies. But if we'd had a problem, the second time we would have done, because there is lead us not into temptation, to me, is a way of saying, may I not please be tested beyond what I can endure.
Further thoughts on some of the earlier points? Evangelicals.
Yes, I have. I mean, on the positive side, I don't want to be too negative, I do find evangelicals have a marvellous warmth and enthusiasm. Many of them live very good lives, and I feel at one with them when they're doing some of their worship and their love of being disciples of Jesus. But intellectually, I've mentioned 2 problems, and there's a third, which is this strange idea that if there is a God who's going to, in some sense, be our judge, the way that it'll be happen, like, at formal size, I very much doubt, that he is overly concerned with what we happen to believe, because that's so much happenstance. And I take a view which is really that of Origen, that when Jesus said, no one comes to the Father but by me, the me is the logos, which is the way God comes to people in the good, the true, and the beautiful. And therefore, what does matter for every individual in terms of their spiritual growth, salvation, if there is a future life, that too, is how they responded to the good, Plato's Trinity. The good, the moral good, the beautiful, the aesthetic good, the true, the scientific and historical truth, and so on. How people have responded to that. And the huge claim of Christianity is that the Word, which is all these 3, was incarnate in a particular life. That's a unique claim, which as a fairly orthodox Christian claim. But that means that exactly what you believed is very secondary. Whether you have responded to the good, the true, and the beautiful as an atheist, as a Buddhist, as a Christian, is what matters. And if you've been someone who's tortured people and you claim to have responded to the good, the true, and the beautiful, however much you are a pope or cardinal or anything, it won't help you much. And so I think this is a way in which I can combine a genuinely religious view of life, rooted in what I see the Old Testament, with this rejection of a certain stream of evangelical preaching. You must believe the right things. I think it's important to try and have right beliefs, because in the long run, the truth matters. But that people will be judged because they happen to have wrong beliefs, that just seems to me to be weird. And in this, I'm not original. This is what I read into Origen in the 3rd century.
Well, it perhaps leads to another question. which is how far does your charity to non-Christians extend? One of the things that really upset me in the evangelical camp was perhaps what you're talking about, which was that 3/4 of humanity seemed to be destined for eternal damnation, or at least not salvation, because they didn't believe in Jesus Christ. And having spent a lot of my time in the Far East and so on, I find it a bit sad that my friends over there are going to be consumed by everlasting flames.
Indeed. We are on the same hymn book here. But this particularly is a Calvinist. Anyway, Calvinism taken literally. One has to be careful even here, because in the Arminian tradition, which is a much more liberal form of Calvinism, and my PhD was on Grotius, and he was an Arminian. And in the Catholic tradition, you've had theories about extra ecclesia, nulla salus and all that, but in practice, an awful lot of Catholic spiritual advisors have been much more liberal about this, and they managed to sneak all kinds of people into heaven who weren't Catholics or even Christian. So I think this is a much sharper criticism of a certain kind of evangelical Protestantism. I mean, Protestantism has quite a lot going for it. I mean, the priesthood of all believers, I think I go for that, and the individualism which we need, but it also has a lot to answer for. So peasants' revolt included.
So you would not feel that Hindus, Buddhists and others were necessarily beyond salvation?
Absolutely not. Have they responded to the word in the good, the true and the beautiful? And the Christian has the joy of affirming what I believe to be a truth, that the word was incarnate. But if you don't believe that, that's not responding to the word. It's just not believing something I believe is true.
Coming back to the further thought you had on the limitation on God's power to do with computers and the calculation of various mathematical problems, where are his limitations?
Well, of course, one has to be very hesitant here to lay down the law about superior minds and so on. But we know that if you can give a computer a problem which it can't solve because it's not solvable, and the example we've just discussed is, try to, unless you've explained the reasoning, in which case it will give you a reason why it can't answer it, give me the highest prime number. We know that this lovely Greek came up with this idea of multiply all the prime numbers together and add 1, and you got this beautiful proof there isn't one. So if you set the computer the problem of finding the highest one, it'll grind on for eternity. Well, if this is a pretty poor analogy, but we'll use it. If there is an infinitely powerful mind, or infinite meaning as powerful as is logically possible to be, which is very important, then there are, and you try to make a universe in which something like our love and responsibility can come, there are much more strict limitations than there might be. And I suspect that many aspects of the universe are not choices. I mean, I'm not saying God couldn't make another universe, but it might be surprisingly similar in many ways if it was to produce beings like us. If it were just to produce light and heat, that's another matter. But if the purpose of the universe is to bring forth joy and self-knowledge and love, and this is where my humanist friend, my second humanist friends and I are very often on the same bandwagon, because they think there's something extraordinary and transcendent, though they may not like that word, about the emergence of love, particularly at the human level, though I'm not excluding it from the higher mammals as well and others. And to me, the weakness of secular humanism is it has this huge sensitivity to the overarching importance, but doesn't have a philosophy that can give it an adequate grounding. And that's my main critique of secular materialism, which I respect, but I think it has manqué in this sense.
How do you mean a sound grounding?
You need a philosophy that's adequate for the burden you want to put upon it. So if you're having a doctrine of human rights, you need some doctrine of what it is to be a person, what it is to have a right, what it is for something to be ethical, that can bear the weight of making this really important. And Herbert Hart was a secularist, of course, but one of the features of the moral law for him was this importance. And I don't think he dug deeply enough into this. It's not only that you have to feel it's important, you have to feel it's really important. And most secular systems, the humanity is too ephemeral, too chancy, to have this weight. Now, this is not a logical proof. It's more like a kind of Kantian argument that I want something that's adequate for the weight that's going to bear upon it. I don't think either theism or atheism can be logically demonstrated one way or the other. They can be more or less coherent. And as I mentioned earlier, I think there are at least 7 or 8 possible coherent overall philosophies, and you have to weigh them rationally by their overall consistency, not by a demonstration that this is the only right one. I mean, the other possibilities are agnosticism, some form of monism, and some form of logical positivism. That's 5 to start with anyway, which are all coherently defendable.
You mentioned, well, I haven't mentioned here John Polkinghorne,
yes,
who combined being a theologian and a great scientist. Yes,
he would be a little more careful because he says he's fundamentally a mathematician who is into physics, so mathematician and physics, and he never claims to be a great theologian, but fascinated by theology and trying to apply the insights he's had as a very fine physical mathematician to theology.
Do you, and you mentioned Dawkins earlier, do you see actually any conflict between science and religion?
Not when they're properly understood, I don't. I think psychologically there is, because you know this word scientism, which is the claim that science is omnicompetent, which some of the Enlightenment people believed. But that seems to be a distinction from science, because scientism is the claim that scientific methodology is the method in all fields. And quite apart from theology, it seems to me inadequate for history, for literature, for music. You know, one of the troubles is one tends to take here's physics and here's theology, but it's often much healthier to say, let's look at poetry, let's look at history, look at other things. The canons of rationality here are quite important and to some extent can be spelled out, but they're not the same as in physics, where you have the experimental method and the repeatability and all these other things. And theology fits with a whole, and so does metaphysics as a part of philosophy, in my view, legitimate part. It's not a sort of out on left wing. It has much in common with these other intellectual disciplines, where there are different criteria for rationality. One of the things I'm interested in is trying to spell out what we mean by rationality. And say my trouble with Dawkins is that I think, although I respect him and his integrity too, and as a scientist, and I do not object to him being an atheist, I think there's a fundamental irrationality. And when he talked to my friend Keith Ward, who was Professor of Divinity, he said at the end, of course, you're not really a Christian, or something to that effect, you see, because he wants to attack the caricature. I feel much the same about Marxism. Marx in its crude forms can easily be dismembered. But there are Marxists who have a much more subtle version of Marxism. I'm still not at ease with it, but I don't think I can disprove it.
And when you said Dawkins was irrational, what did you mean?
In particular, there are several ways in which he caricatures and distorts the thing he's attacking. I'll give you one example. He says, the church early on, more or less arbitrarily, no, I think he says arbitrarily, completely, chose these 4 Gospels. This is simply unhistorical, because the 4 Gospels we have, we know from the Chester Beatty and Martin Bodmer papyri, were all around in the 1st century. We have actual bits of paper, papyrus from about 125 AD. And the so-called Gnostic Gospels, which are very interesting and important, with one possible exception, a 2nd, 3rd or 4th century. The Gospel of Thomas is an interesting special case. So the 4 Gospels were chosen because, so far as we know, they were the apostolic ones, the early ones, which were written within memory. That doesn't mean the others are nonsense, and the church can be justly criticized for suppressing them when they should have been fascinating literature, but they were chosen for perfectly good historical reasons. And then another occasion, he treats metaphysics as if it were an empirical hypothesis. Now, there is a hypothesis of a general kind. Can I think of the life as if there were a God and try and live that way, as a kind of hypothesis? But it's not an empirical hypothesis which can be tested and falsified. And therefore, although theology and philosophy in many ways too has rational criteria, they're not empirical hypotheses. And he's completely missed the boat on this. And then he says, you shouldn't believe anything without evidence. And he's quite right. But he doesn't then say, what do we mean by evidence? In metaphysics, we mean how you interpret the whole. In physics, you mean how you interpret this. So he's incredibly loose when it comes to what looks like a great throwaway. I only believe what the evidence will show me. Of course, he's right. But then the subtle question is, what on earth do you mean counts as evidence in these different spheres? So I find his... when he gets to metaphysics, exceedingly bizarre.
You came back to Cambridge because Sally had a job here.
That's right.
How long have you been back?
19 years. And I've been teaching a little bit sometimes in the medical faculty, the odd thing for philosophy, but mostly in the divinity faculty. And I'm a bit of a fraud because I have no degrees in divinity, though I do a 2-year graduate course, but they don't seem to mind too much. So I'm a professor emeritus of philosophy, pure and simple, but I teach in the divinity. And I was examining PhDs and tutoring, but I don't do any more PhDs. At 84, I don't want to take on that commitment. I still supervise and give some lectures.
And what do you teach on mainly?
Bioethics, ethics, and philosophy of religion. I gave the Introduction to Metaphysics lectures 3 years ago when someone was on sabbatical.
Well, we're just coming towards the end, but is there anything that you would have liked me to have asked you that I haven't?
I don't think so. I've enjoyed meeting you and this lovely college. And perhaps one thing I haven't expressed is my extraordinary way in which the two people inspire me, whose names haven't been mentioned, Johann Sebastian Bach and Franz Schubert, in their quite different ways. From the age of 11 or 12, they've been my spiritual source of energy, and I don't think that's unconnected with the rest of my life.
Do you listen to them and write or create at the same time, or is it just...
No, I listen to them, particularly unaccompanied Bach. I'm a violinist, and one of my daughters is a very good professional violinist. I'm an amateur, and I used to try and play the unaccompanied Bach, but I don't even try now. I listen to them, and particularly the cello suites and the B minor, the Matthew Passion, and Schubert's Lieder and his last 3 quartets and the string quintet. You know, I'm not a person who has mystical experiences, but with Bach and Schubert and sometimes other people, I feel lifted into another transcendent dimension. That helps to explain what makes me tick.
That's a lovely way to end. So thank you very much indeed, Michael.
You're welcome.